Make sure you check out our online store where we work with our graphic designer to create stunning garment and product designs that feature a wide variety of aircraft types such as British fighters, World War II aircraft, American bombers, Russian fighters and much more. You can pick your favourite designs and personalise any items within our Redbubble store that range from clothing right the way through to stationery. All of our designs feature our logo so you can show your support for the channel while getting a quality product. You can head to our website aircrewinterview.tv and click store, or go to redbubble.com/people/AC interview. Thank you and enjoy. So Mal, when did you first become interested in aviation?
I suppose it was a slow process. I grew up around aviation. My dad was in the Air Force for 35 years as a pilot, so we moved around a lot, and I would just be around aeroplanes as I grew up. But it was never really I never really had it in mind that I was going to join the Air Force or fly when I grew up. My big plan was I was going to be an architect until I got to sixth form. And I started looking into the implications of an architecture course at university, and realised it was something like a 5-year course plus then professional qualification time. I thought that sounds way too much like hard work, and so I just sort of fell into the Air Force completely by accident.
So when did you actually join the RAF?
Joined in late 1986 and graduated from officer training at Cranwell in middle of 1987.
So did you always want to become a nav?
No, I applied initially for pilot, as is the way with a lot of folks, and you go through all the aptitude tests and they say, yeah, your aptitude's fine for this and that, better for navigator than for pilot, and you don't get to choose at that stage, so navigator it was.
So can you talk us through some of your basic flying training and the aircraft you started on?
I did my flying training at Finningley in Doncaster, now Doncaster Airport, not for much longer sadly. And you do, as with all the training follows a similar pattern. So you start with ground school and learn the basics, and then you go and do a bit of flying, and then you return to ground school, and it's sort of step-by-step process like that. So actually the first flights we did were on the Bulldog. We did 4 flights on the Bulldog, which is just to get you familiar with being in the air and see who's horribly airsick and who isn't. Then you go back into ground school, and then the flying training syllabus is then split into 2 parts. So you do the basic phase of training, and that itself is split into 2 as well. So the first part of that is on the Domini. So you would do some ground training, simulator exercises, and then go flying in the Domini. A bunch of trips on the Domini, and this is all medium level work. Just getting used to flying, operating an aircraft with kit, that kind of thing, airways flying, using the radar, those sort of things. Then at the end of that, you return to ground school and do the jet provost phase. So we were flying T5s and T5As at Finningley, and again ground training. Then you get flights in the jet provost, and that was to see how you were at low level. So you've actually done the Domini section at medium level, then the jet provost section at low level, and at the end of that, so you're now about halfway through the training, they make a decision on who's got the aptitude for which type of flying, and they'll stream you either what they called Group 1, which was basically ground attack or air defence, or Group 2, which was air mobility and ISR.
So did you actually have an aircraft you actually wanted to go into? Did you want to go to the F3, GR? What was your choice?
I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Yeah, I desperately wanted to go onto the Tornado because it was a new aircraft at the time. This is, I'm 87 to 89. I was doing my nav training. The Tornado was relatively new in service. I'd actually been at Cottesmore when the first Tornado was delivered to the RAF.
Oh, wow.
And flew in there. So that might have sown a seed, I suppose. But then the second half of the flying training at Finningley is a repeat effectively of what you did first time around, back to the Domini, but now you're flying the Domini at low level, so that's getting you used to, having been streamed fast jet for me, back to the Domini at low level this time to get you used to operating with kit in a low level environment. Then onto jet provosts, and you're doing low level navigation, target runs, that kind of thing. Although the jet provost syllabus was split into, it was 2/3 ground attack, and then you did 1/3 was air defence. So they're really just sounding you out for your aptitude for various different roles at that stage. So at the end of the whole thing, We had a big postings party where both halves of the course come together, the Group 1 and the Group 2 halves of the course, and it was, I mean, carnage, frankly. There were, drinking challenges and fancy dress and all sorts, and eventually out of the barrel you pull your posting. And mine was to the Tornado GR1, which I was thrilled to bits about. The options really were, you either went air defence, which would be Phantoms or F2, F3 at the time, or to ground attack, which was Buccaneer or Tornado. And we knew there was a Buccaneer slot for our course, and 3 of us were in the running to get it, and there were various criteria for what meant you would get sent to Buccaneer, but essentially it was how few sorties you'd failed on the course so far, because the Buccaneer didn't have as much nav kit as the Tornado, so it was deemed that required a bit more nous to fly it. But I was desperate to go to the Tornado, and luckily one of the other guys got the Buccaneer slot. So,
so what were your first thoughts on the Tornado GR1?
It was there's another step in the flying training actually, which is you go for having finished at Finningley. I went off and did a couple of months holding. Most people did. I went out to Larbrook for 2 months, just in a ground roll out there, and then there was a Hawk phase to the flying training. So I went to Chivenor over the early summer of 1989 and did my Hawk flying there. And the Hawk cockpit is tiny.
Yeah.
It's you're really wedged into that thing. And then the step up to the Tornado is so vastly different. I mean, the aircraft's like twice the size, the cockpit's commensurately much bigger. So where in a Hawk you were jammed into the cockpit like this, in the Tornado it's like you're sitting on a throne. You've got space around you. You can, you have that impression of it being so much of a bigger aircraft and more powerful aircraft, but also with that much more space. I suppose in a way it felt more secure because of that, because you've got a lot of ironwork around you, this big aeroplane. In the Hawk you feel quite exposed. In the Tornado you felt quite sort of snug and tucked in.
So you've definitely felt a bit safer.
Yeah.
So can you talk us through some of your flying training on the GR1?
Yeah, the first half of it, back then it was done at RAF Cottesmore, what was called the Trinational Tornado Training Establishment. So that was Brits, Italians and Germans all flying together. The squadrons were mixed. One of them was led by an Italian, one by a German, one by a Brit. I happened to be on the Brit squadron, but I was crewed with an Italian, top bloke. We got on like a house on fire, and the flow of the training is the same. So you do classroom-based training, then synthetic training in the simulator, which was very much more of a procedures trainer than it was a simulator. But and then so effectively you'd practice a sortie in the sim and then go and fly it in the air, and then that's the flow right throughout the training. And the 7th trip from recollection was the one where we got to go crew solo. So wow. Max and I taken an aircraft off together for the first time as students, and it feels like it really feels like I don't know, hotwiring a car and going off joyriding or something. You feel like
what's happening here?
There's an element of this shouldn't be happening, but and yet somehow here we are.
So did you ever get to drop live weapons during the training phase?
No, not at that phase. In fact, at Cottesmore you don't do any weapons at all. You do simulated attack profiles just using the software in the jet. But it wasn't until we got to Honington for the second half of the training, for the advanced part of the Tornado training, that we got to drop weapons. But even then it was practice weapons. So you'd have 3 kilogram practice bombs to replicate low-level lay-down sorties, and 14 kilogram bombs to do loft bombing, toss bombing, stand up range from the target. You pull up and drop the bomb. We did do some strafe with the 27mm cannon, but that was the extent of the weapons training there. So everything's simulated, because the jet has its own software internally that can simulate all the different types of weapon for the attack profiles.
Mm-hmm. Didn't the Triple T always fly clean jets, or were they tanked up sometimes?
Yeah, they were pretty much clean.
That must have been fun.
Yeah, and the remarkable thing is that a clean Tornado, although it's got less fuel because you haven't got the external fuel tanks, because it's got so much less drag, you'd get the same duration out of it as you would by putting the tanks on. So it was a strange thing putting the tanks on, but you really, because of the drag of the Seablees, the carrier bomb light stores, the things that the practice bombs go in underneath the aircraft, the drag of those was significant. So you then, once you got onto that phase of flying, you had to have the tanks on the aircraft to give you the fuel to fly the sortie. Yeah.
So what was your first frontline squadron?
I went to the 16 squadron at Larbrook.
Nice.
The Saints. Larbrook, well, everything slotted into place for me. It was going on to the Tornado, going out to Larbrook, having held there. Everything was just as I wanted it to be, and going out to 16 Squadron. And frankly, it doesn't matter which squadron you do your first tour on, because it's always an excellent tour. But Germany was a special place anyway to do your first tour, and Larbrook was a great place to do it. So we were based at Larbrook, flew sorties across Germany, across the Benelux countries, back to the UK. The world was kind of your oyster for the flying training side of it there.
Does it ever feel like work? Because it just doesn't sound like work, but it just sounds like amazing fun.
We're here at Solway Aviation Museum today, where I do some volunteering, and when people ask me about my time in the Air Force, I said, well, it was way better than working for a living, which is flippant, but it is. It's long days and hard work flying the aircraft, and but it just somehow never quite feels like work. You're absolutely right.
You weren't getting up and like, I have to go into work today kind of thing.
No, absolutely not. But you're still training. So when you arrive on a frontline squadron as a junior nav or junior pilot, there's a whole syllabus to go through to become combat ready, and the focus of that initially is on the strike syllabus. So the Tornado had the nuclear role, as did the Buccaneer at the time, and the priority is to get you nuclear weapon qualified, which is a massive pain in the backside because everything has to be absolutely perfect for obvious reasons. I've heard that before. So you have to do something called the strike quiz, which was in the Wing Operations Centre. You would go and you'd be quizzed on the procedures for nuclear weapons flights. You'd be quizzed in detail on something called Supplan Mike, which was the NATO targeting manual, the procedures for a nuclear war, effectively. And then you'd also have to go through something called WST, Weapons Standardisation Training. And that was where you initially did ground school to learn about the weapon, its effects, and everything about how the system worked. And then you would be tested when WST would come and visit the squadron or the station. And that, again, everything had to be absolutely perfect on that.
Bit nerve-wracking?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you fail your nuclear weapon qualification, you're no use to the squadron. So you would have to go and find, they'd redeploy you to another aircraft type.
Really?
Yeah.
Even after all that training and everything?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was pretty intense. And then around that, you're also doing part of your attack combat ready workup. And it takes about 5 or 6 months to get fully combat ready on the jet, which I achieved in June of 1990.
Big day then.
Yeah, it wasn't. We were on deployment at the time. We were out at Goose Bay. So you would deploy. There were generally two big exercises the squadrons would do each year. One was to Decimomanu in Sardinia, which would either be for a bombing practice camp or for air combat training. And you would go to Goose Bay on something called Exercise Western Vortex. And again, Goose Bay was another. It was like Cottesmore in many ways. The Germans were out there as well. The Dutch had a presence there. It was a Canadian Forces base as well, so they had F-18s there, I think, on quick reaction alert. So that was a very tri-national flavour or quadrinational flavour to that base. But it was these massive low-flying areas where you could get out and do some of the stuff that it was difficult to do in the UK, particularly flying the Tornado had a terrain following radar system, which was absolutely superb and could fly you down to a couple of 100 feet, hands off in all weather. But there's very few places in the UK you can do that training. The Highlands restricted area is one, but you have to book it in advance. So anyway, you go to Goose Bay and the areas are open for you to do this, with one exception, which is the caribou migrations.
Oh, right.
So where in the UK or in Germany, before a sortie, you check the NOTAMs of the day, the notices to airmen, and they tell you any areas that you have to avoid overflight, and that might be because of a festival going on or restrictions over, you can't overfly hospitals and things like that. In Canada, there's generally none of that, but there'll be a big NOTAM telling you where the caribou are that day, and you're not allowed to overfly them because it interferes with their migration patterns.
Right.
So you'd check for the caribou migrations, and then you'd have the whole flying area to go out and do operational low flying down to 100 feet or bad weather TFR training.
That's great. You don't think about things like that, the caribou migration. You just don't think, do you? Like, it's a really interesting point there.
Yeah, there was actually the other difference with Goose Bay was that because there was a range that you could bomb on which was unmanned. There were targets out there, but it's right out in the middle of nowhere, and in the summer it's tinder dry, so you can't drop the practice weapons we normally use. The 3 kg and the 14 kg bombs have a little flash charge in them, smoke and flash charge, so that the range control can spot the bomb.
Right. Yeah.
If it on them many times it doesn't actually hit the target. But at Goose Bay we weren't allowed to use those because of the risk of starting a forest fire. So we had to use the 28 pounder instead, which was a US practice weapon. And the only significant, I mean, the ballistics were slightly different, so you had to put a little frig into the software to tell the aircraft it was dropping a different weapon. But the difference was that it didn't have a smoke flash charge. So you weren't getting any feedback on how your bombing was, but you were getting the practice of dropping bombs on targets without the risk of setting fire to
probably a
great swathe of northeastern Canada.
Yeah, you wouldn't want that on your mind, would you?
No.
But maybe can you tell us, because I'm quite interested in this, was there like an average day for a GR1 nav? Like, can you just describe that for our viewers? Did you have a lunch break at 12:30 or
No,
like
there's absolutely nothing like that. The flying program is king. So whatever the flying program says dictates everyone's pattern for the day. So you would either be on the flying program to fly, or you might be on it to go to the simulator, or you might be on it for something else. So you might be, the squadron always had a duty crew whose responsibility would be to keep the place clean and make sure that people are tidying up after themselves and just sort of generally keeping on top of whatever jobs need doing during the day. If you're on the flying program, it would be one of, generally speaking, the squadron would fly 2 or 3 waves a day. If it was day flying, it would be 2 waves. If there was night flying, you might have a 3rd wave in the evening. And so your day would be dictated by what time your MET brief was to come in to start preparing for the flight. So if you're on first wave and it's an early takeoff, you've probably got 2.5 hours of planning and briefing before that. So if you've got 8 a.m. takeoff, which wasn't uncommon, you'd be on the squadron for 5:30 to get your MET brief and start planning and getting the sortie together. If you were lucky, you might have had sufficient advance notice the day before that you could get the majority of the planning done, so you might be able to push the start time back in the morning. But then you'd then take that average day, that 5:30 start, 2.5 hours start planning to take off, fly an 1.5 hour sortie, or maybe if you're doing a high-low high to the UK, that might be 2.5, 2 hours 45. So you're getting back late morning. Then there's the debrief to do, run through the films, see what your results were. So it's an 8-hour day just for the one flight. And then you've probably got something else to do. You might fly again in the afternoon, particularly if you're going through a workup. They try and bang you through that as quickly as possible to get you useful. But if you weren't flying in the afternoon, you might be in the simulator, or you might go and do something called DAO, Duty Aircrew Officer. So whenever there was tornado flying taking place, the squadrons would take it in turns to have somebody up in the air traffic control tower.
Oh, okay.
Just in case something went badly wrong, in case there was an aircraft with an emergency, an unusual emergency, the DAO would be there to advise the air traffickers on any particular requirements that might come up. So for some emergencies you might need to take an approach end cable, some you might be anticipating the potential of a departure end cable. So you would just be advising air traffic control, because it takes the crew a certain while to work through the checklists. You could probably arrive at a conclusion before them to tell air traffic, right, you're going to need to rig the approach end cable for this. So that's the duty aircrew officer's job. Most of the time, you can imagine there aren't emergencies happening every day, so as DAO you're quite often sat with your feet up just enjoying the view and watching the flying. But yeah, so you could be doing DAO, or failing that you might be just, if you got spare time, there wasn't really such a thing, but you would be heads in the books, learning about aircraft systems, learning about, like I said, supply mic for the nuclear weapons stuff, or there's always something to read up on the electronic countermeasures suite, whatever. You never know everything, so
you never complete it, really.
No, exactly. Now, if you were night flying, the difference would be that your MET brief would be much later. You'd come in about lunchtime to get a MET brief and do your planning in the afternoon, and then go off night flying. And with night flying, the end of the sortie would probably be a bit truncated because it was wet film back then for the radar and head-up display recording, so that wouldn't, of a night sortie, the photogs wouldn't be in to do that processing, so you might get a little bit truncated debrief and then finish the debrief the following morning to look at the films. But generally it followed that sort of, there's no template day, but the flying program dictated what you were doing.
There's not 12 o'clock lunchtime.
No, none of that.
But you mentioned Goose Bay there, but did you fly on any other large exercises, and how did other nations view the Tornado GR1?
Yeah, we did. So I did a couple of red flag exercises in those first couple of years in Germany. In fact, I did 2 red flags. The first one was so spectacularly unsuccessful because of the weather that it was renamed Black Flag. But I did actually. I did a year and a half on 16 Squadron because shortly after the Gulf War, the squadron was disbanded. It was the first of the ones to go in the cuts, and I was under threat at that point of being sent to a ground tour because they had all these navs spare that they didn't know what to do with. But my boss put in a word for me, and I got sent to 14 Squadron at Bruggen. And the idea with that was I would finish my first tour there, so do the last year of my tour. Eventually I actually did a full tour on 14, so I did 4 years in Germany before I succumbed to a ground tour. But while I was on 14, we did these 2 red flags, and the first one, I was crewed with a pilot called Doug Moole, and we were the chosen crew from the squadron to do a mission lead on red flag.
Wow. So
the only 2 sorties I did on that red flag were the FMIL sortie, because everyone has to do a FMIL sortie to get used to the procedures in the airspace and the like. And then the next day we sat out because we were planning for the mission for the following day. So we were, in charge of the entire shooting match. So all of the planning went through us. We had to decide, or the targets were allocated, and then you decide how you split your assets up. And with red flag, the biggest issue, and this goes for any exercise where all the aircraft are at the same base, the biggest issue is not what happens in the target area, although that needs a lot of attention. The big issue is always the taxi and takeoff pattern to get everybody airborne, to get all the aircraft up through the same airspace and out into the training areas in
mission in
time. Because obviously you want, you get the AWACS airborne first, so they can clear the airspace, and then the fighters go up, and then so eventually you've worked your way through the target areas and who's doing which targets in what order, and out you go. So Doug and I had the mission lead, and that went, to my recollection, went successfully. And then for the rest of that red flag, the weather was dreadful, and we didn't get to enjoy any of the flying. We just had that one really high stress sortie. But then we did do another red flag later on 14 Squadron, which was actually was interesting because it was the first. I think it was the first time the RAF had done a day and night red flag. So we flew about half the sorties we did were day sorties, and about half were at night. And one of those night sorties, I don't recall who I was flying with actually, but our egress off the target took us very close to one of the avoidance areas in the range. So there was what was known as the big box and the small box, and the big box was Area 51, absolutely forbidden to fly in that. The small box was Tonopah test range, where the F117s were based and did their training. And you were still in trouble if you flew through Tonopah, but not as much trouble as if you flew through Area 51. So if you flew through Area 51, you were off the exercise. If you flew through Tonopah, you would have to sit out a day or two while you considered what you'd done wrong. So this night, our turn off the target took us very close to the Tonopah range. But there was a dried lake bed on the edge of Tonopah, right on the corner of the Tonopah airspace. And as we turned off target, we were looking down at this dried lake bed, so we knew we were outside the area. But back in the debrief, for the debrief for red flag, all the aircraft are instrumented. You all carry an instrumentation pod on the wing, and it tracks your every move. For the fighters, it validates their air-to-air shots. So the pod is king, and they have triangulation stations around the range that track the pod and see where you're going. And the debrief, they put up a massive screen of the training area at red flag, and you appear as little tracks on there, just like air traffic control radar looking at the world. So every aircraft is individually tracked, and it was immediately apparent to us sitting in the debrief that the tracking looked slightly out. That when we were ingressing through the target, there were certain areas we were flying over and we knew where they were, and we were slightly displaced from them on the screen, and we thought, that could be an issue. So as it's during that debrief, whenever a shot was taken out in the area, the blue air or red air will stand up and say, freeze there. At this point, Tornado takes a target on F14 and it times out as a valid kill. So they'll have a quick look at that. Right, okay, unfreeze, carry on. And our little blip is tracking along the area and going straight for Tonopah test range. Oh, this is bad. And just as we're about to hit our tracking blip is about to hit the edge of the box, somebody says, stop it there. We're thinking, well, we're done. We've been rumbled. And somebody says, okay, down in the southwest area here, B1 is targeted by an F-15. And so someone said, okay, play that through. So we're all watching B1 and F-15 down here. Everyone's watching that except us, and we're watching our little dot track apparently through the corner of the test range area and back out, at which point they say, all right, yeah, it's a valid kill, unfreeze, and we get away with it because everyone's been watching this air-to-air bit, and our bit was just glossed over, so we were happily escaped unscathed from that, even though we knew we hadn't been in the area, but it looked for all the world like we had.
Absolutely. So yeah, as I said before, how did the other nations view the Tornado? Did they actually see it as a threat or anything like that?
Yeah, I think, it was a capable enough aircraft for its time. You know, we didn't have, back in those early days, we didn't have a targeting pod to do laser guided bombing or anything. That didn't come until the Gulf War. And even after the war, they were so scarce that for the majority of exercises, you didn't have them. So we were generally a dumb bombing aircraft unless we were dropping laser guided bombs for somebody else to spike. But even so, the nav and weapon aiming system was pretty accurate, and we could carry a reasonable warload. So we were comparable to the F111, which was still kicking about at the time, or the A6. Yeah. So yeah, there were no qualms with getting us integrated to packages and things. Things we lacked were secure radios and that kind of stuff. Yeah. Corners were always cut on costs with those sort of things. But for the most part, we would slot in easily to a package, and even on ops, actually, you would fit the US Navy, because they use the same air-to-air refueling method as us. And have very similar procedures. You would fit in easily with anything they were doing, but it all worked out easily enough with the USAF as well.
Did you integrate with other nations on a social level?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go back to Goose Bay, and I said you've got the Germans there and the Dutch, everyone had their own bars, and you would occasionally get an invite to go to one of the other nations' bars, and so there was always good-natured banter on that front. Yeah.
I can imagine. Yeah.
And throughout the training, particularly in Germany, you also did a lot of training with other nations' air forces anyway. So you would do squadron exchanges. So I remember one time a Norwegian F-16 squadron, I think, came out to Larbrook to fly with us. Sometimes you would get to fly on the return leg of that as well. You would do things like something called ample train, where you would do a landaway to another NATO nation's base, maybe somewhere in France or a German base or Italy or wherever. And that would give the ground crew there a chance to do some servicing on the Tornado.
Yeah.
So you'd fly a training sortie down there, land, go and have lunch. If it was a French base, there'd be wine on the tables at lunchtime. You had to resist the temptation. Yeah. And then the aircraft would have been serviced, and you'd fly a training sortie home again in the afternoon. So between those squadron exchanges and the cross-training exercises, you saw quite a lot of the other nations as well.
You've also flown the Tornado in combat. Can you tell us about this and your experience?
Yeah, so my experience of the Air Force in general was shaped by events in 1989. And for example, I told you before, my dad was in the Air Force and did 35 years, and his career was pretty much overshadowed entirely by the Cold War. Well, so I said we did our Tornado training in 2 phases, and the advanced phase was at Honington. The day of my first trip at Honington was the 9th of November 1989, which is the day the Berlin Wall came down. And from that moment on, everything kind of changed. And there was a slow dissolving of the Cold War around us, and it didn't. There was no knee-jerk reaction. Everything carried on as if the Warsaw Pact wasn't disintegrating. I think as much as anything, because people didn't know what else to focus on. And then in that first year out in Germany, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And from that point on, my career was almost entirely focused on the Middle East. So you joined a Cold War Air Force, and the Cold War had just evaporated in front of you. And you now faced a completely different career trajectory and threat profile. And initially it wasn't obvious that the Tornado was going to be involved out in the Gulf. Most people's first question was, where's Kuwait? Now my squadron boss, brilliant bloke, Trav, he had done his first tour flying Hunters in Bahrain. So he knew all about the Middle East, so we were relatively quickly queued in. But it wasn't obvious that we were going to deploy, so life went on as normal. And early September, we were doing some dissimilar air combat training with the F-15s at Bitburg.
Nice.
So we would fly down there, fight them in the morning, come back home, refuel, go and fight them again in the afternoon. Which, I mean, I say fight them.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's a one-legged man in a arse-kicking contest. But it was a brilliant experience to be exposed to their procedures and a real capable fighter. But on the afternoon of the second day, we heard something that you almost never heard, which was a general recall over the guard frequency on the radios. So a general recall issued for all RAF Germany aircraft straight back to base. Interesting. So we hot foot back to Larbrook and land, and the force is now knee deep suddenly in preparations for Op Granby. Again, initially they chose who was going to go out as the initial squadrons or prepare for deployment, and that I think was Bruggen squadrons. So our role largely was getting jets prepped. The squadron was preparing jets to go to Bruggen. So there was, they were cherry picking jets from across the fleet, the ones that had the least hours to the next major servicing, that sort of thing. So we were doing air tests on Granby jets. So suddenly you're flying in jets painted desert pink, and that was all interesting. And there were little modifications creeping onto the aircraft for Gulf operations. And then probably about November, we got warned that we'd be deploying as the build-up continued. So at that point, there was this is where the thin veneer of the combat ready workup is exposed. So technically, at the end of your combat ready workup, you're competent to go to war with any of the weapons on the aircraft. But as soon as there was an actual war on the horizon, out comes a whole new syllabus.
Wow!
And there were like 20 odd sorties on there that it was desirable for you to do before deployment to the Gulf, because most of us had never done air-to-air refueling. Most of us had never flown in heavyweight fit. Most of us had never flown with the AR5, which is this horrible thing, an aircrew respirator.
Oh yeah.
Which is an all-in-one rubber bag respirator thing that goes over your head, and you wear it with NBC kit.
It's awful.
Absolutely awful to fly it. You just end up drenched in sweat. So we did AR5 flying, never both of you in the cockpit wearing it. So I did 2 AR5 flights, one in the UK and one once we'd deployed. One from Germany and one once we'd deployed. Utterly miserable. The one we did from Germany, we were supposed to fly a high-low-high to the UK. But we got halfway to the UK and we were already halfway through the oxygen because I was breathing that heavily wearing the kit. So we had to turn back, and we never got the low-level portion of it done. So yeah, you went through all this workup, night flying, 4 ships, heavyweight with 8,000-pound bombs on, air-to-air refueling from VC-10s, TriStars, Victors, to get as much practice as you could before we deployed. And then in December 90, so I hadn't even been on the squadron a year, we rocked up at Tabuk in Saudi Arabia.
As you do.
Yeah, exactly. And from that point on, it's the training just continued in theatre. So you do some theatre for mil, but then everything is into a real focus on 4-ship night operations, 8-ship night operations, using the terrain following radar, low level. We flew against some heavyweight training sorties. Nobody, well, perhaps one crew had ever flown with JP233, the runway denial weapon, which was an enormous thing.
Yeah.
So we all I think most of us got to fly with live JP233 rounds on, go up to the tanker, experience what that was like. And then you just into a sort of countdown period waiting for, well, hopefully no war to start. But start it did.
So do you have any stories from flying in combat that you can share with our viewers?
Yeah, there's a few. In fact, I was here at the museum yesterday doing some tours on the Vulcan bomber, and somebody had heard I'd ex-Air Force and was asking me about it, and they said, so did you get shot at then or not? Oh yeah. Yeah, we all got shot at a lot. There is a sort of myth through the war that we achieved air supremacy and that the skies were easy to fly through, but I never felt unthreatened in the skies because there were always systems still up. But in the early part of the war, there was, everything was still up. Although the first night there was a concerted effort to try and take down all the air defences, but you can't get everything. And so Tabuk was the biggest tornado wing, Tornado GR wing, and we were, I think, the most heavily tasked. So that the first week I flew 6 of the first 7 nights, and it was just constant. And the first 3 or 4 of those were low-level sorties, and they were heavily defended airfields. On the first night, Mike Warren, who I was flying with, he and I had to turn back early because we'd got 2 different system failures that meant we didn't have a radar to mark the target, and second, we didn't have one half of the JP233 functioning. But we managed to get out with JP233 on the second night, and we were going to H3 airfield. The boss had the benefit, he was leading the formation, he had the benefit of having seen what the defences were like on the first night. And as we ran in towards the airfield, it was just wall-to-wall anti-aircraft fire everywhere. And he said it was worse than the previous night, and the previous night had been bad. So he said there's absolutely no way we'll get through there unscathed. And he had the sense, and this was a massive signal for the rest of the squadron and everyone at Tabuk. He just had a sensible caption and said, look, this isn't going to be a quick war. There's no point taking us all through that and losing aircraft. So he made it what is the bravest decision I've probably ever seen flying, and said, terminate the attack.
Wow.
At this stage we were already on the final run into the attack, so we had turned more or less as the boss was making this call. So we're flying in a 4-ship in parallel track at night. So you're about 2 or 3 miles laterally spaced and about 40 seconds to a minute apart, so I don't know, 5 or 6 miles apart between the 2 elements of the pair. So they had already turned onto the final attack run to see this wall of AAA, which we could all see it. We could see it from before we crossed the border. The boss called terminate the attack, and at that point we were turning more or less overhead the Amman to Baghdad highway. And as we turned, we got indications of an SA-8 missile target tracker on our radar warning receiver. So it didn't need the boss to tell us to terminate the attack. We had to defend the aircraft anyway. So we executed a 90-degree turn to try and put the target radar onto the beam. I'm chaffing and making sure that the countermeasures are working. Mike's flying the aircraft. We then get locked up again, so we do another 90-degree turn. So now we're heading more or less west at the point that the boss is terminating the attack. So having defeated the radar, which may or may not have been a SAM-8, it later transpired that a lot of the wiring in the aircraft radar warning receiver system was damaged, right across the fleet. So sometimes your own transmissions gave you indications of a threat radar. But we just ended up rolling out south, and about 20 miles ahead of us was one of the Iraqi Air Force's highway strips. There's a part of the highway that was widened and strengthened for use as a deployment airfield. So the boss said just drop on targets of opportunity. So we just lined ourselves up with the highway strip and dropped our weapons there. As we were doing that, what we thought was anti-aircraft fire opened up to the right of us, but we thought, well, we're committed to the attack now. So we did our attack. And the short story of that is everyone got home safely. It later turned out that what we thought had been AAA was actually one of our other formation members dropping their JP233 a couple of miles out to the east of us, the west of us, the right-hand side of us. So, and they had started out that night on the other side of us. So somewhere in all of this, us threat reacting and them turning away from target, we'd crossed over in the dark, low level at night, and somehow missed each other. You're just relying on the big sky theory at that point. So that was an interesting baptism of fire for us. The next low-level sortie we did was equally interesting. We were doing loft bombing by this stage, so we had 8,000-pound bombs on, and a loft attack is what you pull up about 3 or 4 miles from the target, and the computer figures out when to release the bombs, and they just fly free fall down to the target. It was another airfield, and we were attacking a POL site, a fuel dump, but it was co-located with a AAA site. So we had a mixture of fusing for that attack. We had 4 bombs impact fused for the POL site and 4 bombs airburst fused for the AAA site. As we pulled up in the loft attack, the AAA site was firing at us. So they'd got a pretty good bead on the direction we were coming in, and you pull up, you release the bombs, and then you pull the aircraft over hard and pull back out and fly back the way you came. As we were going through that manoeuvre, the tracer from this AAA site was going either side of the aircraft. So you've got, I mean, all you can do is follow the procedures at that point and fly the aircraft and just hope for the best. And how none of that hit us, I'll never know. But we got out of it safely. And then the other one that really focused our minds was, I don't know, probably about a week later or so, and we were up at medium altitude by this stage. And the defences had been well suppressed, but there was still a lot of SEAD activity going on. We particularly often had SEAD support from the US Navy boats out in the Red Sea. A6s or A6Bs firing harms. We sometimes had EF-111s jamming for us. Occasionally our own alarm tornadoes were firing for us. So there would have been support for us on this night, but it was area support by this stage, so they weren't dedicated to each strike package. And we were bombing a target to the west of Baghdad. A glorious clear night. The Iraqis had got the message by this time that if they fired guided missiles, they would get shot at. So they were firing unguided missiles, and it was fascinating to watch. We were just flying along in towards the target, watching missile launches around us, and just kind of, you can trace the missile and see where it's going, and it's not tracking on us, that's fine. Just as we're approaching the target area, we start to get, we're into the attack at this stage, so I'm working the radar, we've got the target identified. Out in about hour 1:30, 2 o'clock, the radar warning receiver comes up with SAM-2 target tracker. So you get a little siren with that to warn you, so that's it's not a huge problem at this point. I put chaff out, make sure the pod is doing what it should be doing to jam. Mike and I discuss it quickly. So we're pressing on with the attack. The next thing that happens is that changes, that siren and the display and the tone change, and it goes to SA2 missile guidance, which is a warbling like woo 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 to really get your attention. And at that exact moment, a massive flash down on the ground, and a SAM-2 missile comes off the rails, and we know it's launched at us because we've got the indications in the cockpit. We're so close to bomb release at this time that we think, right, we'll just press. We'll press with the attack. I'm chaffing. I'm making sure the pod's jamming. So we release the bombs, and we can, because it was fired at us at relatively short range, and it's a 2-stage missile, the SA-2. So it's got a boost phase, then that will drop away, and then there's another rocket that guides it to the impact. So the benefit of that was we could track it throughout its time of flight. Because it was short time of flight, the engine was burning throughout, so we can see the missile. So as soon as the bombs are released, Mike just turns hard off target, pulls down into the missile, or where we think the missile is, bearing in mind it's dark, but you're just watching the flame. And we just do what the missile. It must have worked to an extent because it detonated behind us somewhere, close enough that we felt the blast.
Wow!
But we didn't get any battle damage from it, so the warhead missed us. And then you just got to get back to the formation, get to the tanker, and get home.